For those of us who work in politics, it may appear to act against our own interests, but I think one of the things we've heard time and again is that the depoliticisation of infrastructure planning, procurement and funding is absolutely critical. And our final session for today is brought to us by EY, facilitated by EY's Director of Infrastructure Advisory. Please welcome Angela Augier.
Tēnā koutou katoa no whangaroa hea hau. Engari e tipo aki anō aki au ki Tamaki Makaurau. Ko Lane tōku whanau, ko Myrna tōku mama, ko Tony tōku papa, ko Angela Augier tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. What an interesting conversation we've been having today. I have been enthralled by it. I think Ross mentioned that we could have a drinking game about every time the Infrastructure Commission was mentioned. I'd like to up the ante on that, as I think we could have a drinking game about every time the words pipeline, politicisation and certainty were mentioned. And I think you're going to be pleased to know that we're going to discuss that in this panel. And so that's going to be a very interesting conversation, because we are suffering from a generation of underinvestment in infrastructure. We have an infrastructure deficit requiring around 104 billion, leading the government has stated today to commit 70 billion in funding across health, transport, housing and education in the next 5 years. However, this spending only gets us up to now. And based on the Infrastructure Commission's estimates, there's an additional $60 required to be planned for in renewals for every $100 we invest in new infrastructure. That's a very significant amount of work. And for things that are close to my heart in terms of the energy sector, we're looking at 10 billion a decade on the electricity transmission system, 25 billion a decade on the distribution networks, and the investment in the generation kit to allow for increased electricity use and decarbonisation. And that's before we've even started thinking about climate change adaptation and resilience. That is a massive workload in front of us. We are certainly going to be busy. And while our projects are not that big in global terms, they are substantial. They require professional management, they require us to attract the right talent to supplement our workforce. So surely overseas contractors should be interested in this forward pipeline. So why can't we just get on with it? Now, to help me discuss these issues today, I'm going to be joined by some very learned colleagues. The first of which is Amelia Lindsay, who is the Group Director Advisory and Chief Planner at Beca. She is a geographer by training. Amelia is a Technical Director in Beca's planning team and Chair of their Sustainability Steering Group. She has directed many community-changing strategic and policy planning, infrastructure planning, statutory consents and consultation projects. If you'd like to join me on stage, please. Amelia. I'll also be joined by Jeff Cooper, who is GM Strategy at Tuahanga, the Infrastructure Commission. Jeff has a background in global policy, having worked for the United Nations, the United States Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and he is a former Chief Economist for Auckland Council, where he worked on infrastructure, housing regulation, and financial policy. And the last person to join me in the hot seats will be Jeremy Holman, who is Chief Infrastructure and Investment Officer at Te Whatu Ora. Jeremy Holman joined Te Whatu Ora on 5th of December 2022, which is quite an exact date. In this role, Jeremy provides national leadership for the planning and delivery of capital projects across the Motu. And the reason for that date is that it's quite a new role, being quite a new organisation. Jeremy was previously the GM Infrastructure Delivery for Crown Infrastructure Partners, with responsibility for the delivery oversight of 6 billion of major infrastructure programs receiving New Zealand government stimulus funding. So I think that will be a learned crowd to discuss these issues. I'm going to start off with you, Amelia. I said I would. And ask you about certainty, that word, because it seems like it's very certain that we're going to be certainly busy.
Yeah.
So what more do you need? What's the problem for you as a consultant and contractor?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think for us, we are an organisation made up of people. So we talk a lot about the public sector, the private sector, what all of those, the different parts of the system, but actually it's all about the people and the investment and the time that we can take into investing in our people and growing them and giving them the opportunities that make exciting careers. And I think to me that's what the certainty needs to do. I'm a little bit nervous about the pipeline certainty and the idea of 30 years of infrastructure mapped out. And part of that's because back in 2000, I think it was, when we looked at, started the Waterview journey, we picked up the Duluth-Cather plan of 1965. And what would we have if we had done pipeline certainty of that project 35 years later? We'd have a filled Oakley Creek, not a restored wetland Oakley Creek that we saw in the presentation this morning. So I think we need to be careful about what we mean by certainty, and I don't think it's necessarily a list of this project will need to look like this and this and this, but I think it is about that investment certainty, and it is about certainty to the outcomes that we are trying to drive to. So if we have those things, then we have the confidence to commit to the people investment, the innovation investment, and some of the change investment that we need to do from the private sector to respond to the increasing complexity of outcomes that the community that our people are asking for. So I think to me it's about getting that right mix of certainty certainly in commitment. So when we see a project starting, we can start investing and seeing that project delivered. And that is a hugely disruptive thing, when you can spend months getting ready for a project that never seems to come out of the investment decision making or never seems to come out of the consenting process. But I think those tools are there in terms of getting that, but it's definitely a commitment to getting that delivered. But it's not necessarily about having every project listed, because I think we are aware and we are live to and open to the challenge of we need to innovate our way out of solutions. We need to understand that what we were thinking we needed in infrastructure 35 years ago isn't what we're going to need in infrastructure today, and that we as a team can collaborate to respond to that challenge.
So it's good that someone's mentioned the Duluth-Cather report. I don't think we should get through this without mentioning that. I would like to also make sure everyone's aware that we will be taking questions from the floor on Slido as well, as per usual, so please put those in. So Jeff, I mean, pipeline certainty, that's probably your thing. So you've heard what Amelia says. I mean, what is it in reality? What does it mean? And are some parts of the pipeline more certain than others?
Yeah, so just to follow on from Amelia, really, I think there's some really salient points there, that over a long-term horizon, over 30 years, the certainty that you want in the first decade actually looks quite different to what you want over a 30-year plan. And at the Commission, we kind of separate these things out into three different tools. You've got the National Infrastructure Pipeline that I'll talk about in a second, and that's funded projects. They're on our website. There's $92 billion worth of them there. There's a lot of certainty about what those are, where those are, and what they look like. In the middle, you've sort of got this idea of the infrastructure priority list, which I'll say what Ross said, go along to the session tomorrow to learn a little bit more about that. And that kind of middle 10-year period, we know a little bit more, right? We don't know everything, but we certainly know more than the outer years. And then in those outer years, we might know even less, right? We might know that we need some schools and some hospitals and some roads, but we might not know yet where those are or what technology we'll use to deliver them. In terms of certainty on the National Infrastructure Pipeline that we have currently, at first glance, you could kind of look at it and go, well, there's $92 billion in there. That's a lot of certainty about what's going to be delivered. And so, you know, what we've done through that process of collating and putting that out there is thinking about sectors and stacks, right? So in the pipeline, we have 7, 8, 9 different sectors in there, and we're also cutting it by different types of infrastructure spend, whether that's planning, delivery, operation, or maintenance spend. And once you sort of decompose that, you can actually start to see that in some parts of the infrastructure system in New Zealand, we do actually have quite a lot of certainty, and we do quite well, right? So let me sort of go through three kind of issues that we've seen come out of that process. The first is a set of issues that seem to affect all sectors and all parts of the stack, broadly speaking, right? The first of those is consenting issues, right? Case for change around RM reform. It is taking a lot longer to deliver infrastructure projects and go through that consenting process. We're spending $1.3 billion a year on consenting, and that number has gone up 150% over the last 5 years, okay? So that's something we hear cross sectors. Other issues, supply chain rigidities, that's well known from the past couple of years. Workforce and immigration policy is a big one that seems to be across all sectors. And related to that, house prices and cost of living, right? Because if you can't afford to live in the city, you probably can't afford to get labour to live in that city either. And so house prices cut across these issues as well. And the last one's probably price stability and economic cycles, which affects most sectors as well. Then when we think about where is it in the system that you see more certainty in the pipeline, right? You tend to see more certainty in the sectors that have some sort of user charges element to them. Regulated utilities, airports, telco, energy, where there's a fund of money and people are paying for the services, we don't tend to hear those sectors talking to us about funding shortfalls, which I think is an important insight. Second one, rebuild projects, right? When you're not pushing against the status quo, but when you're trying just to rebuild something. When that's done through a fast-track consent process, we tend to see actually quite a lot of certainty through those processes. And the third one that I would sort of say in that area is maintenance programs, right? We almost certainly don't spend enough on maintenance, but when we do spend money on maintenance, it tends to be quite forward-looking. Contracts can be 7-10 years out in advance, and it gives the sector a lot of certainty. So to give you an idea, there are some parts of it that are quite certain. Then when we think about where there's less certainty, when you're relying on centralised funds, right, particularly in times of cost escalation, you can expect to have a very uncertain sort of time of things. When there's political contestability, when projects require significant physical location of workers, right? Some parts of projects can get workers from offshore through design processes and don't necessarily need to locate workers. So there's that as well. And I think when you're pushing up against these market capacity things generally. So that would be where you're getting more certainty and where you're getting less certainty, I suppose. And then it leads on to the question of, well, you know, what could we do differently in order to get more certainty across that, which is a different question.
So we've talked about certainty, we've talked about a pipeline, and now it's time to address the other P, I think, which is politicisation. So I think it'd be interesting to understand what impacts politicisation has for our infrastructure build-out, and how does that infrastructure deficit that we're facing impact that, Jeremy?
I think that when we talk about politicisation of projects, there's kind of three aspects to that. I'm a mechanical engineer by birth, so the first element is whether there is a desire to build projects that look good, rather than fix the stuff in the background, like plant rooms and all those unsexy stuff, but actually provide resilience. There's that side of it. I think the other side of it will also be, and it's been talked about while we've been here today, about sort of different parties and different ideals on that side of it. But the other side of it that I've sort of, that we can talk about from many perspectives is the lobbying that goes on from infrastructure providers, infrastructure owners, to be able to bring in the support of their councils, of their local MPs, of whatever. Where you've got a limited funding envelope, you've got many different people that are wanting to dip into that. The politicisation of projects can become quite a big deal. Those that shout first, those that can shout first, those that shout loudest are the ones that get the funding. And I think the key thing, there's pipeline, as you say, is a word that has been used a lot. I'm going to try and not use that word and talk about infrastructure investment plan, which its fatua is something that we are undertaking at the moment. Previously we had 20 different DHBs, all bidding for money out of the health capital envelope. And again, from that side of it, you ended up with lots of piecemeal projects going on that weren't connected. And that doesn't give industry the assurance and the pipeline, sorry, use that word, that it wanted, that it needs. It doesn't help with your contractors, it doesn't help with your consultants. So a piece of work that we've got to do before Christmas, by Christmas to get to Cabinet, is the first infrastructure investment plan. Now, that is an iterative process. It's going to be the first one of it. The other piece of work we've got to get done by that end of the year is our asset management strategy. So now we have full visibility, or we are getting full visibility of the whole health infrastructure estate. that infrastructure investment plan will draw upon, first of all, the priorities of my clinical colleagues and where they're looking at their service and their models of care and how they're going to provide service, but also we can then look at the state of the assets that we have to be able to prioritise. And then from that is a 10-year plan that we are wanting to put out to be able to give some certainty on what we are spending, what we're investing in, and that gives some, that may morph slightly over time, but that ultimately, whatever your view on politicisation of projects, that should hopefully remove and reduce the ability for that to happen because we've put it out on paper. Not only does it send a strong message out to the industry, but it also, I suppose, keeps us honest because we've put it on paper.
So that does sound like a good step forward to put everything on paper. And Amelia, perhaps you'd agree with this. So what more do you need to invest more than 3 years ahead?
I think, so there's a couple of things that I think could help with that. I think that the indication of going forward is really important, but also some consistency across the different sectors. So for example, we are very aware and we recognise the importance of the wellbeing outcomes, the environmental outcomes, the decarbonisation outcomes, the local employment, the Māori economy and connections to Māori. I think one of the big opportunities that we see that would help us invest in committing to those things is consistency across some of the sectors in terms of how those things were going to be measured, in terms of how those things were going to be evaluated in procurement, and the consistency both between the messaging perhaps and the procurement processes, but also consistency across different government departments would really help us get commitment to and investment in the systems changes that we need to do to respond to those drives. So I think that's one area that I think we could really support ourselves, and that's reporting on the other end, and we've talked a bit about that reflecting back on how and what outcomes those projects have delivered. So we are looking to continuously improve and advance those projects. And I think it's sort of wrapping some of that, setting targets, but providing certainty on how we were going to measure those, and then reporting back on how we've done and how we're progressing on some of those things, I think would really help us as a private sector invest in some of that change.
Yeah, and I guess there's also the point where not all of this can be delivered by these large national infrastructure advisory and consultancy firms, and there is an element that's required of local capacity building, and also we should be looking at iwi Māori content for our procurement as well. I mean, Jeremy, I'm interested in your thoughts about how uncertainty can play into the ability of local contractors or iwi or others to enter the market and actually grow capacity in the regions particularly.
I saw this through my role at Crown Infrastructure Partners where, some parts of the country did struggle to get hold of the workforce that was required for some of the work that was out there. I think by having a plan to start with, it allows contractors the time and understanding of where this work is going to be. I mean, one of the biggest challenges with health infrastructure is not necessarily the head contractor, it's actually about the specialist subtrades that are involved in that work. So when we're looking to build, or fund multiple projects, it's not just the fact of how they are, then bits of them may be able to overlap, but it's the subtrades that we've really got to think about and how we piece that together, especially if they are subtrades that don't exist in some regions, and therefore they're going to need to be mobile, or they're going to need to invest in those areas as well. So I think that is one of the problems that needs to be given more thought, which is how some of those far, not so close to the centre areas are actually going to resource some of the work going forwards.
And I think we look for collaboration in the sector to bring those skills together.
Absolutely.
But again, that is where that certainty and that commitment becomes equally important, because that requires an investment from all of those organisations to build those partnerships, to build that expertise and capacity, and to build those relationships.
Absolutely.
And when you have the certainty, you can commit to that, and when you don't, it becomes a sort of cost on the private sector, which ultimately becomes a cost on the projects around the other end, because we rinse and repeat a bit.
Yeah, and look, as a client, if you like, who is purchasing services, we've also got to think about how we change and moving away from that sort of more combative to a highly collaborative approach. We need industry to work with us. We need industry to bring us the smarts. We need industry to understand that we are now trying to, be a lot more consistent with what we're doing, and we're also trying to, standardize a lot more of our infrastructure. Instead of different, DHBs working on different models and sort of different designs, we want to be able to be much more standardized. What a ward looks like in Northland should be no different to what it is in Southland. An ensuite is an ensuite is an ensuite from a hospital room perspective. And therefore, from that side of it, we want feedback, and we want sort of ideas from industry on how we can continue to do that and move down that so we can better spend money. But it also means that industry can better gear up to be able to help us provide what we're after.
So I think that's an interesting point about how we can build systems and processes that help us have that standardisation across the sector. And I'm reflecting back on, like the North Sea in the early 2000s, which was cost reduction in the new area when the oil price dropped and they needed to have common health and safety systems and helicopter tickets and things like that. I mean, is that something perhaps like the construction sector accord could help us with?
I'm just reminded of thinking about modularisation and standardising what it is that you're asking for. We had a trip out to Australia last year where we got to witness what they're doing over there in terms of standardising classroom buildings. And the cost efficiencies that they've been able to get from that are extraordinary. There is a question in New Zealand about what is it that we're actually building? Are we building infrastructure or are we building monuments, right? And we need to know sometimes what it is that we're building, because we do ask a lot from our infrastructure, right? We tack on a lot of things, and that has implications for how much this stuff ends up costing, which then has implications for how much we can provide.
Mm-hmm. And then returning back to the that idea of politicisation, I mean, if we're thinking about alternative funding mechanisms for infrastructure, this one's for you, Jeff, really, in your position, how can those contribute to reducing uncertainty and depoliticising?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one we addressed, I think, through the infrastructure strategy, but we didn't use the terminology alternative funding, right? To us, when I hear alternative funding, we want to run towards this idea of pricing, right, which Ross talked a little bit about in the previous session. Generally speaking, in infrastructure, we tend to use, as I mentioned before, centralised funds. We don't make great use of prices. A general point here, demand curves are downward sloping, right? Economics 101, that means if the price is low, you demand more of it, right? So if we don't have prices and we centrally fund, you can expect congestion. Right? Aucklanders spend about 5 days a year sitting in congestion. The Soviets found this out with bread lines back in the 1980s and 90s. Same idea. So we're talking a lot about quantities and not much about prices, right? And the New Zealand infrastructure strategy is asking the question of prices. Let's start thinking about what prices can do from a non-built solutions perspective. We don't have road pricing. We don't have much volumetric charging. Our waste levies are far too low. Some of our transport charges are written in legislation that doesn't move over 10 years. And so inflation slowly erodes it. So you look at some of those mechanics, and none of us are surprised that folks relying on centralised funds are talking about funding issues, right? So pricing serves both a demand management role, a cost recovery role, and a really important incentives role. Right? So there's this really great study that just came out of Harvard looking at 2 different water providers, one that uses centralised funds and one that charges by the litre, right? And they looked at how fast it took them to fix their broken pipes when they occurred, right? And which provider do you think fixed their broken pipes fastest, right? It was the one that charged on the litre, because if the consumer doesn't turn the tap and no water comes on, their revenue takes a big hit. So what we're thinking about here is not necessarily how much we're paying for investing in infrastructure, but how we're paying for infrastructure. So we can improve certainty through these kind of ideas and methods simply by witnessing sectors that already do it in New Zealand, whether that's transmission pricing or otherwise. Reduce contestability and politicisation of some of this, because you're not competing for scarce resources with hospitals and schools and a myriad of other priorities that can change on an electoral cycle. But you can also introduce demand management, you can avoid building for the peak, you can smooth the path for private finance by bringing on infrastructure that has a revenue stream associated with it, and as I've just said, you can improve incentives for maintenance. So I think alternative funding in the sense of better pricing methodologies is going to be a huge leg up for the sector at large.
Yeah, and I'm interested by that as a concept, because having come from regulated infrastructure sector, I'm acutely aware that most of our, if someone wants to connect to our network, it's capital contribution.
Yeah.
I could take a view as an infrastructure provider that I put that on my regulated asset base and charge it back as an OPEX, but it's a capital contribution. And that then pushes the cost of that decarbonisation onto the person as a capital expense straight away. And in the context of bus charging, for instance, that could then push the cost of electricity network development into the public transport sector and provide a barrier for creating the right public transport networks. So how do we think about that when we're connecting these two sectors together?
Well, I mean, one point I would make there is you're speaking to the fact that our infrastructure sectors are more interconnected now than they ever have been, right? And that is one of many examples of that. All the more reason to have a coordinated infrastructure strategy that speaks across sectors, and I think New Zealand's on it, as is the rest of the world, by the way. Our sectors have grown up in silos. And because of these big cross-cutting themes, whether it's resilience issues, whether it's decarbonisation, whether it's about environmental sustainability, we're now asking sectors to actually talk to each other more than they ever have. And so it's one of a number of issues where we need to start, moving around the room and talking to sectors a little bit more. Yep.
Yeah. So, a question from the floor here. I mean, coming back to your point, Amelia, about collaboration, how do we collaborate across the sector to improve alignment of reporting? What are the mechanisms we can use? And should that be government-driven, or does it need to be sector-led?
Well, I think actually some of that goes to Jeff's comment. The sector is multi-sector for it to be led well. So I think it does require coordination, at least from a government perspective, because I think it will have, it is calling on more than one sector to look for some of that consistency. I think certainly it is an opportunity perhaps for us to collaborate in coming up with that. And so we're not bespoking every outcome and issue that we're trying to drive towards, and we're getting some consistency in terms of how we're going to measure those outcomes and report on them. And there are tools and there are bits of work going on with that, with the wellbeing outcomes, for example, in terms of how might you measure those and how might you apply them consistently. So I think there is some private sector development of those, but I think some coordinated and collaborative commitment to them would be a really good step, and I think at some point that would need government collaboration, involvement in that to support it, particularly because they are the buyers of a lot of the procurement process that we're talking to, or the buyers in that process, sorry.
And thinking about the capacities of the public sector to deliver the projects, this one for you, Jeremy, is really, and standing up a new group as you are, how do we address the skills deficit in the public sector to deliver the projects and be good clients?
I think the first thing that we need to do is actually sit down with those within the industry and be open and talk about the challenge that we have, because ultimately, my view on infrastructure in general is much more collaborative approach is the way that we need to understand these things. We can't do all the heavy lifting and then just put it on the table for a contractor or consultant to pick up and get on with it. We've got to completely change our mindset. We've got to be a lot more open in the way we do things. I think, we've had some good feedback from industry, which is, if you go down things like the very traditional contracting route, that's not necessarily what the market is after. So therefore, how do we work together to be able to share better some of those risks? Because a lot of it comes down, when you talk about capacity and talk about capability, it comes down to risk management. And, how do you better apportion those risks through your contractual mechanisms to be able to get the infrastructure that you need? And I think it just involves a grown-up conversation. The public sector will always, to some extent, be the public sector, but there are people that move back and forth between it. But I think we shouldn't necessarily look at it as two sides. We will become much more enmeshed as we go forward. We get that certainty of work that we want, or that certainty of work that we need to procure, and we create these partnerships. Partnerships has got to be the way ahead, really.
Just to comment on that, I think we put out a paper a few months ago now looking at cost benchmarking in New Zealand and looking across sectors. And this really gets to how we learn as institutions. And there are some institutions in New Zealand that actually we're really cost competitive. Wind farms, we're actually right in line or below where international benchmarks are. One of the ones where we're not, and it's not going to surprise anybody in this room, is tunnelling, right? Something that probably, if land prices continue to escalate the way they are, you can expect we're probably going to do more of this. The last 4 tunnels in Auckland have been delivered by 4 different institutions. And so talking about how do you build the capability for some of these highly complex infrastructure projects, you know, there is a sort of a question of how we learn and develop talent that can deliver them over time.
I totally agree with you. I think maybe an example. I heard today Nicole Rosie talking about local procurement as part of a requirement for the procurement on projects, and totally understand it and support it. We know that we need to start talking about reporting on our decarbonisation and how our businesses are performing and delivering to those. And we know we are looking at measuring Māori employment and what the opportunities are that we're providing in the projects. When you add those 3 things together, that requires a system change for local small players in terms of their carbon report. It's like the health and safety. There's a whole system change coming, and there is an uplift that is needed for those local providers to be able to support that. And for us to be, you know, for other organisations, for larger organisations to be able to support that, that's where I think the certainty and the collaboration is really important, so that we know that we are investing in something that will be consistently measured across sectors in terms of delivery, and that we know that we are contributing, I suppose, positively to those, to achieving some of those outcomes, because otherwise there is a risk that they will compete with each other. The biggest way for us as a larger organisation to have certainty on our carbon is actually to reduce our supply chain complexity, but other drivers, local collaboration, requires us to increase that. So it's just getting that balance right and getting some certainty on what that will look like, I think, is an example.
Yeah.
I think coming to Jeff's point, and not necessarily about tunnelling, but if you've got that large lumps of work that are going out to the market, and you're effectively putting them out individually to 4 different people, first of all, you're going to have a cost implication, and secondly, you're going to have a productivity issue. And that on and off, of projects, and the sort of piecemeal stopping and starting of projects, whether it be through the way that funding comes or through political ideals, is something that drives our productivity, and that's something that gets talked about all the time. Could you have done that as a program of work? How do I've got a number of hospitals in a program. How do I link that as a program together so that actually I've got a collaboration, if you like, of consultants and contractors to make sure that we're learning from each one as we go, rather than, right, we finished that one, what do we do with the next one? You've got to think about it as a suite to get that, to get better economics for your projects, but also from an industry perspective as well.
And I think in the scale of New Zealand, things like driven projects are driven tunnels are a good example, because we do need them, or potentially need them, across a few sectors: the road, the rail, the water. And if you get, I'm getting dangerously close to using the word pipeline, if you can get some coordination and packaging of those projects together, then that provides the opportunity to get
We
that
not just had a
surety.
tunnelling machine that kept moving around and doing a whole load, and turn left when you get here and it goes under the harbour as well.
Why not?
Well, we're thinking creatively about that, so I'll pose this one, which is about thinking creatively about our hospital network.
Yep.
And in a decarbonised world, would it make sense to decentralise some of our social infrastructure and have more district hospitals and regional hospitals to reduce travel in Boston?
So that's a conversation that is going on at the moment. My internal client, if you like, is the hospital and specialist services area of Te Whatu Ora. And that whole model of care is being looked at the moment about, do all roads lead to a big hospital? I'm not a medical person, but, hospitals are not places that people actually want to go to for a variety of reasons. And therefore, can you do care much closer to the community? There's a number of things that have to be taken into account on it. First of all will be the ability to resource that, and the ability, therefore, of what can you do closer to the community compared to what is within the hospital. But those conversations are going on at the moment, from how we might do things differently going forward.
Yeah, and especially with telemedicine and other
Yep,
advancements. Being
absolutely.
able
The
to,
whole digital, the telemedicine
Yeah.
side of things, there's a lot more that can be done as well as that whole preventative piece of work, which,
Yeah.
you know, everyone is very keen to work on, but, you know, it's a time and an education piece.
And final question is for you, Jeff, to round us out. I think we've had a clarification, or probably someone seeking a clarification about infrastructure pipelines, and said instead of infrastructure projects, wouldn't it make sense to form a list of evolving population needs and prioritise that instead?
Population needs.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's the question?
So I mean, I think from our discussions, it sounds a lot like your issues list, priorities issues list. versus the
No, that's right. I
solutions.
mean, I think that, you know, I think we're talking about the infrastructure priority list here. Look, one of the things that, you know, we've obviously looked to Australia on this one. We have Peter Colaccino talking tomorrow on this, but, you know, what they have done a good job of there is separating problems from projects. And I often think a lot of the time we get ourselves into a tangle because we're trying to solve the problem and the project at the same time. And it pretty quickly leads to people going into their corners. What I like about the Australian way of doing this is that they quite intentionally separate out the question of what the problem is from the project at a very early stage. And then they publish a set of priority problems, things that they think infrastructure could actually solve, right? And it's not until years later that you start thinking about, well, what would be the optioneering that you would do around this problem? So I think that's getting that kind of process right of planning and actually doing it from a much earlier stage might get us to a point where we are able to get more political buy-in and an enduring consensus on projects and problems from a much earlier point. So you're not right at the back end of a project going, what was the problem again? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's excellent. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank you for your excellent contributions. I think that we're now getting the flashy red signal that means we need to get off the stage, and certainly have some certainty over the drinks. But thank you very much for your time. I'd like you to thank our panellists further. Thank you.